welcome to all of you to today's presentation. Behavior change starts in people's minds. This is the basic idea of the presentation I would like to give today. And I would like to illustrate how we are using this to develop effective behavior change communications, not only for crop residue burning, but in general. And I would like to present the example of tackling crop residue burning to illustrate and make this more practical. My name is Max Freidrich, and I have two aims today. Present a systematic approach to behavior change, the Ranas approach, and to show how we use this to tackle crop residue burning. First of all, I would like to acknowledge and thank the project partners who have contributed to this. I would like to thank Kheti Virasat Mission, KVM, an NGO in Punjab who has been pioneering to work on organic agriculture there and to find alternatives to crop residue burning. I would like to thank the Center for Sustainable Agriculture in Hyderabad, who were our partners in this. I would like to thank my colleagues at Ranas Model, Bono Sen, who is here, and Hans Mosler. Of course, all the study participants who gave their valuable time and frankly shared their opinions with us, our interviewer team from the Amritsar College of Engineering and Technology, and I would like to thank the Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation for funding this research. And many thanks to 3IE for giving us this platform to be here today. And thanks to you for coming here and for your interest. How to introduce behavior change? I think this is a question many researchers and practitioners have been asking themselves, because many problems that we currently face as humanity actually originate from behavior. It's people's actions. It's us driving a car that contribute to Delhi's air pollution at this moment. It's us using more or less water, contributing to water scarcity. Or it's us, or some of us, who burn their crop residues. So that means many problems that we have today originate from human behavior. So it's a very crucial question how we can introduce change to our behavior. And this is where our approach to behavior change comes in. So let us start with the context. We feel, or we say that every human behavior is located within a context. Yeah? We don't operate, we don't act in a vacuum on ourselves, but we are embedded in a context. And in the case of the crop residue burning, the context can be described, for example, as the financial situation of the farmers and the costs that it incurs to manage the crop without burning. We have to consider the legal situation, existing bans of burning, here represented by the Punjab High Court. And of course, we have to consider the technological context, which machineries are there, which machineries are available to the farmers. But in the end, where we want to be is we want behavior change. And this is, I would like to illustrate through farmers using different ways of managing their crop residue. For example, a happy seeder allowing to sow wheat into the standing stubble, or to incorporate the crop residues into the soil. Or here we see an example of farmers composting their crop residues. And if you look at those two pictures, what is the difference? Costs. So these four up here and these down here? People. Who said that? Yes, it's about people. So if we talk about behavior change, we have to talk about people, not only about the context. And this was our aim in this study, because we felt that the public debate on crop residue burning was actually dominated by discussion about money, about machinery, about bans, and we felt that the farmer's perspective, the ones who are actually the actors in this case, has been left out. So looking at the person means that we have to not only look at the context if we want to change behavior, but we have to make efforts to promote a specific behavior. And this is nothing new. If you're watching TV, all the ads that you come across, are actually promotion of specific behaviors. So the corporate sector has very well understood the necessity and importance and the power of this, while I feel in other areas this understanding is still lacking. So now let us understand a bit better what we mean here by person. So far this is kind of a black box for many, and this is where the psychology comes in, that we want to shed light into this black box of the human brain, of how we are taking decisions and how we are acting. So what we propose is that behavior is determined by behavioral factors. Behavioral factors can be specific perceptions of the reality. For example, the perception of what a specific behavior costs me. What are the financial costs, but also what are the costs in terms of expenditure of time. Another perception of reality, another factor could be, what do other people expect me to do? Me presenting here, I have some idea what you expect me to do. So I try to satisfy that. So the perception of what I think you want me to do is actually driving my behavior. And there's many more. So if we assume this, that behavioral factors are driving behavior, that means that in order to change behavior, we have to change the behavioral factors. And this is what our approach is about, and this is what I would like to present to you today. The Ranas approach to systematic behavior change conceptualizes that process through a 4-step procedure. The first, to identify the potential behavioral factors that might be steering a behavior. So in this phase, we can become creative. We really open up to whatever could be a behavioral factor. Once we have done this, we move on and we measure all behavioral factors, and we determine the ones, we identify the ones which are actually relevant. So we narrow ourselves down. Based on this, we select specific behavior change techniques to change those factors, and we design our behavior change program. And finally, we implement it and we evaluate it to see whether it had the expected effect on behavioral factors and on behavior. And I would now like to walk you through those steps using our study on crop residue burning, starting with the first one. So as the very first step, we set out in a qualitative study to get from the farmers themselves the potential reasons of why they're burning or why they're not burning. So we asked them. And here we have our colleague from KT Virasat Mission interviewing a farmer who is burning his crop residues. And his basic responses were, I have no machinery, I have no money, and it's just too much straw to handle within such a short time. Interestingly, his brother, sitting here, is not burning his crop residues. And we asked him, and he said, I know how I can do it. He knew how to manage his crop residues. And he also had this moral feeling that non-burning is the right thing to do from a moral perspective, while burning is morally not appropriate. And finally, he had a very specific plan of where he would get the necessary machinery, of how he could get the necessary labor, when he would have to start with the preparations. So interestingly, two brothers from the same family having adjacent land holdings chose different behavioral options. And this is interesting because it shows us it's not only the context. Context is very similar for them, but it's also the mindset of farmers that is actually deciding on whether a farmer decides to burn or not to burn. So this was our first tool. We used these qualitative interviews to get the perspective of our target audience and also of other key informants from policy and other organizations who have been working on the topic. However, it is not enough to rely on this, we can say, anecdotal evidence, because we were only able to talk to a very limited number of farmers. Yeah? So we need to design an effective intervention. We have to also rely on existing evidence and theories. And this is where the Ranas model comes in. What the Ranas model does, it structures the abundance of potential behavioral factors that have been identified in the last 40 years maybe of psychological research in behavior change, to make them usable to design interventions. And it clusters the behavioral factors into 5 groups. The first are risk factors. Risk factors are about knowledge, awareness of risks, yeah, vulnerability to a specific health risk or an environmental risk. Attitude factors are about the beliefs, about costs or the benefits. What do I have to invest in terms of money, in terms of time, in terms of other things, and what are the benefits that I get? While this is a rational choice model behind, we humans are not only rational beings, but feelings play an essential role in our decisions. So feelings and affective beliefs are also part of this attitude block. However, humans do not act and take their decisions in vacuum, in isolation. We are social beings, and this is where the norm factors come in. Our perception of what others do are a very strong driver of what we do. Our perception of what we think others want us to do is a very strong driver of what we do. And our perception of what is right and wrong can also be essential. Then we have ability factors. Has it happened to anyone that you were thinking, oh, I want to do this, but then you thought, but I think I have no chance to be able to succeed in doing that, and then you didn't even try? Has that happened to anyone in the room? Yes. Yes. And this is where ability factors come in. Our confidence that we are able to do something, our confidence that we are able to continuously engage in a specific behavior, yeah? And our confidence that we are able to recover after a setback. Another question to all of you or us is, has it happened that you had an intention? Oh yes, I want to go to the gym twice a week. But then in the end, it didn't really happen as you planned? Yeah, okay, good. And this is exactly where the self-regulation comes in. Self-regulation means, how do we put our good intentions into practice? Yeah? And this is also an important behavioral factor, that farmers might have a very strong intention, I don't want to burn. But then out of sudden, it doesn't work out with the machines, laborers don't show up, the harvest is later than expected, and out of sudden, the good intentions are not realized. This is why self-regulation plays a role. So now, we use the Ranas model in all of these factors to identify what could be the drivers of straw burning. Yeah? And this is what brings us to step number 2. Output of step number 1 was, we now know which behavioral factors could be responsible. Now we want to measure them, and we want to determine which ones are the actual ones that matter. And for that, we need quantitative data. We see pictures here of our enumerator team being in the conversation with different respondents. We surveyed more than 600 farmers from 4 districts in Punjab. And what we did, we asked them first about their behavior. So what are they doing? How are they managing their crop residues? And this is what we see here. We see on the horizontal axis, we see different options of how straw can be managed. The first being burning, the second being incorporation, putting the straw back into the soil. The third being mulching, that means covering the soil with the straw. The fourth being composting, taking the straw off the field and decompose it there. Then animal bedding, animal fodder, options that are ex situ, where the straw is removed from the farm, such as for an electricity generation or for biogas. A specific machine that allows sowing into the standing stubble, and finally other options. And what we see here is the share of farmers that used each of these specific options in 2017 and 18. While this is interesting, it's nothing new. More or less, we knew these options exist. We were not sure how many farmers actually use them, but actually these data are self-reports. So there is most probably some bias because farmers would know what to say. On the other hand, we felt that many farmers were very frank, admitting, yes, I'm burning, because it was clear we are not from the government, but from a private research institution. But still. What we now did, we divided our sample of farmers into non-burners, those who use exclusively any of these alternatives, and into the burners, those who are burning. And what we now did, we compared those non-burners to the burners in terms of the behavioral factors, to see in which factors do they differ and in which factors do they not differ. If they didn't differ in a specific factor, that means this factor is irrelevant for the behavior. Yeah? If someone who doesn't burn and someone who burns, if they both have exactly the same perception of what is right and what is wrong, then we can conclude moral considerations are not relevant for this behavior. However, if we would find a difference between the doers and the non-doers, that would mean that the factor is relevant, yeah? And that we have to consider it when designing an intervention. And this is what I would like to present now. This is the doer-non-doer analysis. With regard to the risks and the attitude factors, we see very limited differences between the doers, the burners, and the non-burners. We see environmental knowledge to be very similar. Health knowledge of the health consequences of burning, very similar. We see that the awareness of consequences of burning are negative. Farmers are aware that it is bad for health, for environment to burn. But still there's a very subtle difference between the burners and non-burners only, and so on. So we don't see any difference in mindset between burners and non-burners in the attitudes and risks. With regard to costs, this is where we see a difference. We see that the burners and the non-burners perceive the costs of non-burning differently. Yeah? We see that the non-burners perceive the costs of non-burning about 1,000 rupees cheaper than the burners. So here we have an indication that the financial considerations play a role of whether someone burns or not. Looking at the norm factors, we see strong differences with regard to all factors. We see a difference in the perception of what others do. We see a difference in the perception of what farmers think others want them to do. So farmers who do not burn perceive a stronger social pressure towards not burning. Yeah? And we see that farmers who do not burn have a stronger feeling that non-burning is morally right and burning is morally not okay. Coming to ability factors, we see that the knowledge of options of how to manage straw without burning is similar. That means burners know as good as the non-burners about the alternatives they would have to burning. The knowledge is the same. Also with regard to the specific steps, the procedural knowledge, the exact techniques how to apply specific non-burning options, there was no difference. And this is putting into question many approaches that say, okay, we have to teach farmers how to manage the crop residues without burning, because this shows that teaching them doesn't make a difference. However, what does make a difference is this confidence in performance, the confidence of being able to do it, and the confidence to have an impact on reducing adverse consequences of burning. And finally, in the self-regulation factors, we also see substantial differences. We see that action planning, the level of how specific farmers have planned of how to manage to get the machinery, the laborers, on how to time their activities, actually plays a role. We see action control, the level to which they are aware of their good intentions during the whole preparation phase for the crop residue management plays a role. And we see that the ability to anticipate potential barriers and to have coping plans on how to overcome those barriers also played a role. Now, how we see substantial differences between farmers who burn and farmers who not burn. I think this has come out very clearly of our doer-non-doer analysis. And this means we have to tackle those behavioral factors that we identified here to change crop residue management. How do we do that? This is where the third step of the Ranas approach comes in. And basically, I would like to illustrate this with the example of the norms. So our analysis that I just presented has shown norm factors steer crop residue management. That means we have to change the norm factors to change crop residue management. How do we do that? For that, we have to rely on existing evidence which has been generated during the past decades of behavior change research. And this existing evidence is summarized in the Ranas catalog of behavior change techniques, because this catalog, for each behavioral factor, this catalog gives us behavior change techniques to change that factor that were shown to be effective in previous studies. Yeah? So to change the perception of others' behavior, we have to inform about others' behavior, or we can do a public pledging. This is what the existing evidence, the scientific literature is suggesting us. And that means to change norm factors, we can inform about others or by a public commitment. So we have actually responded to our question, how to change norm factors. And for all across our results, this leads to 4 conclusions on how to design a behavior change campaign to tackle straw burning. Because of the difference we observed in the perception of monetary costs between burners and non-burners, we conclude that informing about the true monetary costs of non-burning would be an effective intervention. Because of the difference in the confidence in performance and impact, we conclude that we have to bolster the confidence in ability of the farmers, that they are able to not burn. Yeah? Because of the difference in the self-regulation factors, we conclude that an effective intervention needs to facilitate planning of how to manage crop residues and needs to facilitate planning of how to cope with barriers that might come up. And because of the difference in norm factors, we clearly say somehow we need to establish a social norm, for example, through those behavior change techniques we took from the Ranas catalog. This is kind of the last step would now be to implement and to evaluate those interventions. But at the moment, in our study, we are here, and this part is still to come, and we're actually looking for partners to implement this with us. So I would like to just give you an example of another intervention from India on latrine use of how such an intervention could look like. Yeah? So what we had found is that actually the perception of what other people do, it was a very strong driver of whether people use the toilet or not. So we somehow concluded, okay, we have to make people think everyone else is also using the toilet. And we did that by, after families had committed to say, okay, we will use it, to take a family picture on a commitment template, and that was then given to them and put outside the house. So over time in an intervention villages, more and more families put out those commitment pictures. Yeah? And that means more and more families thought, oh, the others are also using the toilet. And this is how we slowly were able to change the perception of what others do. All these were reminders put on the cleansing mug that people use for open defecation. Or here we have a daily routine planning where farmers using pictograms were structuring their early morning to plan, okay, when do we use the toilet during our busy morning schedule, which is strongly habituated that we found. Okay, just to illustrate how an intervention could look like. These are results from past impact assessments. You will see we mostly use this approach for wash behaviors, and we were able to achieve quite substantial changes in behavior throughout these studies. To sum up, what makes the Ranas approach special? Because there is so many approaches to behavior change, and models are there. Everyone is creating his own model and putting his name or her name and saying this is the best model. We don't claim that. What is special here is that it's a very structured 4-step approach that can be applied to basically all behaviors, and that we are combining existing evidence as far as it is available. We are not reinventing the wheel. We are building our work on what is there already, and we only come in by creating new and context-specific evidence where it is actually needed, where we need this specific one. And this is done in our qualitative interviews, when in the beginning we open up and we ask people, hey, why do you do what you do? And this is done when we do our doer-non-doer analysis, the quantitative analysis. This has to be done every time, because in every target population, it can be different factors that are in the end relevant. And of course, the evaluation will create new evidence that again can be included into the evidence base, such as the Ranas catalog, where we then know which activities change which factors. And also, if we discover new factors, these can also be included into the Ranas model, into the existing evidence base. I would like to end where we started. Behavior change starts in people's minds. I hope I could illustrate this a little bit and show that this is actually useful to understand behavior and to conceptualize and design behavior change interventions.
And thank you for having me here. I had the opportunity to read an early draft of the report this morning, and I found it to be a fascinating read. There were lots of interesting insights in there, which I really hope that that this report, once it's out, is widely read. So what I try and do is try and sort of a big picture-ish perspective of why I think something like this is interesting. I briefly try and talk about what were the takeaways which I personally found were most interesting from the report. And because I have to, I will also try and sort of push back a little bit and try and poke a few holes. Yeah. So, all right. So, firstly, our larger air pollution control strategy in India has extensively relied on administrative solutions, right? The idea that, look, here is a problem, we are going to ban this problem, and then we are going to figure out how we are going to enforce this ban. And then inevitably sort of complain about how enforcement has been a challenge. When we choose not to ban things, or when we choose to couple the ban with something else, we typically have technology fixes of some kind. In some ways, the Happy Seeder program is an example of this sort of let's try to solve this issue with a subsidy on this technology which will make burning go away entirely, right? And we do this for various different reasons. In general, I think a larger reorientation is needed when it comes to how we think about our interventions to tackle different sources. Historically, our formal environment regulatory approaches have focused on the big point sources, the power plants, the industries. And in those instances, some of these are likely to work better, where you can rely on monitoring of a certain kind and enforcement that looks in a certain way. It's not the case that those interventions have worked very well either, be it power plants or industries. There are various issues that plague their monitoring and enforcement. But when it comes to the dispersed sources, things like stubble burning, certainly, or waste burning, or construction dust, these will almost certainly, these are highly unlikely to work. Because it expects a certain superhuman governance capacity, which quite frankly we don't have, right? So as a result, what we want to be able to do is to expand our toolkit quite substantially than what we have, and interventions that explicitly look to address the incentive structures for various polluters, that explicitly take on a behavioral change lens, like what Max has just discussed. They have a very large role to play, and they increasingly have a larger role to play. If we want to be able to do anything about air pollution in the country. One reason why we don't end up having these larger conversations and expanding our toolkits is that the political class has largely ceded responsibility to resolve competing demands. If we want to be able to tackle air pollution, it will almost certainly mean that the costs of reducing emissions are borne by a relatively fewer group of people. The benefits are more widely dispersed, right? Inevitably, there are going to be competing demands and pushback from various groups that get affected. And this is precisely where air pollution not being on the political agenda inhibits our ability to move. Unless there is a political resolution for these competing demands, we will likely be stuck with the various administrative solutions, right? We ban these, and while we do that formally, informally there is inevitably sort of something that works out in the background where the enforcement gets undermined. So I think that's my bigger picture take on why I think we've opted for the tools that we have, and why there is a large demand for being more creative and applying deliberately behavioral change interventions. Now, coming to this study, here are what I thought were some of the major takeaways when we think about the air pollution from stubble burning. One of the first things that struck me in fact, on the first graph that you showed about how stubble gets handled is that in your sample, burning seems to have reduced substantially from 2018, from about 60% on average to about 36%. This is no doubt self-reported, but if that were true, we are winning this, right? I mean, I'm actually a little skeptical about the number, and I'm going to come back. But if this is the case, then we certainly seem to be doing something right. Second thing that I thought was important was that I think it's fairly well known that when there is manual harvesting, burning is very limited or non-existent. In your sample, about 90% of the cultivable land under rice is harvested mechanically through the combined harvest. Right. So I think the relative scale of the two techniques, I think it was useful to understand from the sample that while about 10%, and that there seems to be some heterogeneity across the districts, we have done this. That while on average across these districts, about 10% was manually harvested, in which case the stubble then gets used in different ways. About 90% is harvested mechanically to the combined harvesters, which leaves some stubble remaining on the ground, and inevitably, in the majority of the cases, the farmers burn these simply because that's the easiest thing to do given the limited window available. From your findings on the attitudes and so on, I think it was very interesting that both among burners and non-burners there were very similar, sort of a similar perception of the risks, similar attitudes at play. It is interesting that the non-burners felt there was also like a moral, that was morally wrong to be burning, and obviously that is something that when we're thinking about a behavior change interventions, that's the bit that we try and push on. The fact that the cost of non-burning seems overestimated among burners was fascinating, because obviously one of the things that we keep hearing about is that burning happens because the alternatives are much more expensive. It's interesting that there's a statistically significant difference between what the estimated costs of non-burning are among the burners and non-burners. That the true costs of not burning may be lower than what is imagined. Burning seems to one interesting thing that I wanted to ask about. You mentioned that the income is an important predictor, but I was wondering if net income is the more correct way of looking at this, simply because the input cost of cultivation among the non-burners seems to be much lower.
Input costs, yes.
Right. So, I mean, I was curious as to why this hasn't been framed in net income terms. I mean, I don't know very much about agriculture, so it's possible that I'm getting something wrong here, but there seems to mean the input costs seem much lower in the instances of the non-burners. So
yes.
I wanted to understand that a little bit better.
Okay.
Burning seems to happen more in large mechanized farms than small. I think this was a very interesting finding. That it's not the case that you have the smaller, poorer farmers with lower land holdings that tend to burn their stubble. It's in fact it seems the case that the larger land holdings see more stubble burning happen. And this large small farmer dynamic also seems to play a role when it comes to the way cooperatives function or don't, in terms of sharing the equipment, farmers getting together and purchasing this and so on. That farmer cooperatives are not particularly effective at the moment in Punjab was an interesting thing. And finally, that the narrative needs to change from this very Delhi-centric look, they are burning the stubble and it affects us, and therefore stubble burning needs to be stopped, to they are burning the stubble. The people most directly affected instantly are the farmers themselves. They may not necessarily understand the health impacts as well as they should. And therefore, there is a role that the doctors in Punjab need to play in raising this awareness. There's a role that the media narrative has to be reframed a little bit in terms of why stubble burning should be stopped and who bears the cost and so on. Bang on. I mean, I would completely agree with that. All right. So just a couple more minutes, so what would I like to see a little more of? And I know since this is still work in progress, perhaps this could be addressed. Taking a step back, the stubble burning seems to be largely also an artifact of very specific cropping choices. I mean, paddy is not a traditional crop grown in this region, right? And it has very specific implications on groundwater management, for instance. So I was actually really curious to see if when you're trying to assess attitudes and risks and so on, these were also covered. I mean, sure, there's the burning, not burning question, but then if you had to take a step back and look at cropping choices themselves, I was wondering if your study can shed any light on that. I think the last point, which there are a couple of other things. I'd love to see more village level sort of summaries. Is it the case that you have about 48 villages in your study? Is there a certain way in which the community tends to work, wherein burning happens in some villages much more than others, and so is there sort of a village level dynamic? That would be interesting to see. I would love to read more qualitative insights that lead to these differences among the districts. So there's this great point about how Muktsar, which is one of the districts that you've covered, has higher groundwater levels, and that basically inhibits incorporation because it inevitably leads to rodent infestation and so on. And as a result, nearly 100% of these land holdings in these districts are mechanically harvested, and subsequently there is stubble. That was interesting. Final point in terms of pushback about this, the decrease in burning between 2017 and 2018. To what extent was this an artifact of how the data collection was done? So as I understand it, there was a household survey in September, October 2018, and there was a follow-up telephonic survey in January. And the follow-up survey was basically everybody you had talked to earlier, you approached them again. Some of them did not respond. As a result, you have. To what extent is the fact that some people responded and others didn't explaining the reduction in burning between 2017 and 2018? Is it the case that folks who either changed their behavior or were, in fact, burnt? Folks who chose to burn again in 2018, did they choose not to respond? Because I know you've done an analysis. I mean, you basically compared the demographic factors in 2017 and 2018, but then the cultivation patterns, like that wasn't clear to me. So, I mean, for instance, one thing you could do is for everybody who responded, you could look at the differences between 2017 and 18. So it's a limited sample. Alternatively, if you could help us understand what the differences in burning or cultivation patterns were between those who reported and those who didn't, those might be useful things.
Definitely.
Yeah, with that, I think my long-winded response is thank you very much.